Picture the America of the early 1990s. The evening news crackles with stories of a nation under siege, a super predator panic, a crack cocaine epidemic, and a sense that the country was losing its grip on safety. The year is 1991, a time seared into the national memory when violent crime hit a modern peak. Now, let's fast forward 35 years. This is the story you think you know. But what if that memory, that entire narrative, is profoundly wrong? The numbers today don't just tell a different story, they tell a shocking one. From its terrifying peak in the early 90s, the violent crime rate in the United States hasn't just dipped, it has plummeted by roughly half. The murder rate, despite recent frightening swings, is also down significantly from its own historic highs. Statistically, America is vastly safer today than it was during the era that defines our image of crime. Before we get into the why, you have to grasp the sheer scale of this transformation. This isn't a minor fluctuation, it's a societal sea change. In 1991, the United States was recording 758 violent crimes for every 100,000 people. Think about that. It was a level of violence that dominated headlines and drove fearful policies. By 2024, preliminary data suggests that number had fallen to around 359, a stunning drop of over 50%. Let's talk about the most serious crime, homicide. While 1991 was a peak year for overall violent crime, the modern homicide rate actually hit its apex a decade earlier, in 1980, at about 10.2 per 100,000 people, before surging again to around 9.8 in 1991. By 2024, estimates put the homicide rate at 5.17 per 100,000, slashing the rate by nearly half from its 1991 level. That's thousands of lives saved, year after year. And it's not just violence. Property crime, which affects far more people directly, saw an even more dramatic collapse. From a peak of over 5,140 incidents per 100,000 people in 1991, the rate plunged by an incredible 66%, down to a projected 1,760 by 2024. In fact, recent data suggests that the 2024 property crime rate was the lowest recorded since 1961, and the violent crime rate was approaching its lowest point since 1969. This isn't a statistical trick. This data comes from decades of reporting to the FBI and the Bureau of Justice Statistics. So, the central question of our time isn't just, why is there crime, but rather, what on earth caused this monumental, generation-defining drop? To understand the decline, you have to go back to its violent origins. The peak in the early 90s didn't come from nowhere. It was the boiling point of decades of rising crime, fueled by social upheaval, urban decay, and the devastating crack cocaine epidemic. The political response was swift and immense. It was the era of being tough on crime. This culminated in the largest crime bill in American history, the 1994 Violent Crime Control and Law Enforcement Act. This was a roughly $30 billion behemoth that aimed to beat back the crime wave. It funded 100,000 new police officers, poured $9.7 billion into new prisons, and pushed states to adopt truth in sentencing laws by offering grants if they made violent offenders serve at least 85% of their sentences. This act turbocharged a trend that was already underway. The tough-on-crime era led to an explosion in the U.S. prison population. Between 1980 and 1990 alone, the number of inmates nearly quadrupled, and it surged even higher from there. The theory was simple: incapacitation. If you lock up more criminals for longer, they can't commit crimes on the street. And by many accounts, it worked. But this controversial cure came with profound side effects. Critics point to the birth of mass incarceration, which disproportionately affected minority communities and created a cycle of imprisonment that has been difficult to break. But putting more people in prison is only one piece of a much larger, more complex puzzle. First, the economy. The latter half of the 1990s saw a massive economic boom. Unemployment plummeted, wages rose, and opportunities expanded. When people have legitimate jobs, the economic desperation that can drive crime begins to fade. Second, the crack cocaine epidemic, a primary engine of the homicide spike, began to burn itself out. There are other, more controversial theories as well. Some economists have argued that the legalization of abortion in 1973 led to a crime drop 18 years later. Another theory points to the removal of lead from gasoline, arguing that reduced lead exposure in children led to lower levels of aggression a generation later. It wasn't one single thing. It was a perfect storm. Now this is where the story gets complicated. You might be thinking, a massive crime drop sounds great, but what about the last few years? And you're not wrong. The year 2020 brought a shocking and tragic reversal. The homicide rate jumped by nearly 30% in a single year, the fastest spike ever recorded in the US. This was linked to the profound disruptions of the COVID-19 pandemic. However, context is everything. Even at its pandemic-era peak, the homicide rate was still about 20% lower than its 1991 high. And more importantly, the spike appears to have been temporary. In 2023 and 2024, the United States saw historic, back-to-back yearly declines in murder. Preliminary data for 2024 showed homicides dropping by around 15% nationwide. Even motor vehicle theft, which surged during the pandemic, saw a massive projected drop of over 20% in the first half of 2025. This is the nuance that often gets lost. We see a spike and assume it's a permanent new reality, missing the larger trend. If understanding the real data behind these huge societal shifts is important to you, consider subscribing and hitting that notification bell. It helps us continue to separate the signal from the noise on complex topics like this. This brings us back to the central mystery. If crime has been on a 3-decade-long downward trend, why do so many Americans feel like things are getting worse? The answer has little to do with statistics and everything to do with psychology and technology. First, our media diet has changed. The old adage, if it bleeds, it leads, is more powerful than ever. Second, the rise of social media and neighborhood apps like Ring and Citizen has created a phenomenon of vicarious victimization. You don't have to be a victim of crime to feel its threat. And finally, crime is a potent political weapon. Politicians often find it easier to campaign on fear than on complex statistical realities. We are constantly told we are in danger, and after a while, we start to believe it, regardless of what the data says. So what is the real story of crime in America? It's a story of a monumental, historic public safety success that we have failed to acknowledge. It's the story of a complex cocktail of causes, from controversial tough-on-crime policies to economic booms and the end of the crack epidemic. It's also a cautionary tale about how our perception of risk is now shaped more by algorithms and political rhetoric than by our actual reality. The great crime decline is real. The numbers prove it. But our fear is real too. The challenge moving forward is to base our conversations and our policies on the data, not on the fear. Because the only thing more dangerous than a crime wave is a society that makes critical decisions based on a phantom one, risking the mistakes of the past all over again.